Good evening, I'm Patty Satalia.
And I'm David Price. Thank you for joining us. Tonight on Pennsylvania Inside Out, the brawling at the Pacer-Pistons game highlights the issue of breaking through that imaginary barrier between the contest area and the fan area. Some sports psychologists say that this is really a first for player-to-fan violence, or is it? We'll find a little bit about the history of professional basketball.
We begin tonight with brain drain. The term is used to describe the loss of highly educated and skilled occupational workers to other states. What impact is brain drain migration having on Pennsylvania's economic and social well-being? Dr. Gordon DeYoung is a distinguished professor of sociology and demography at Penn State. We talked with him about his recent visit with Governor Rendell and his cabinet to discuss key demographic trends and their impact on Pennsylvania.
Well, I had the opportunity to meet with Governor Rendell and all members of the cabinet to brief them at a first cabinet meeting of the fall on demographic trends in Pennsylvania and how they relate to some of the upcoming political agendas that he felt were important for the Commonwealth and for his cabinet.
What are among some of the most important demographic trends that you see affecting Pennsylvania?
Well, the ones that we were talking about specifically with the governor and his staff had to do with, first, the trends in our labor force, secondly, our elderly population, third, the changing race and ethnic composition of the Commonwealth, a fourth trend, the changing family and household composition was important, fifth, the nature of migration, particularly migration of young adults who have college educations. These were some of the key things that they wanted to talk about.
Let's start by talking about what many people refer to as the graying of Pennsylvania. Tell us what's happening to our population in terms of elderly and what that means for the bottom line. What does that mean for Pennsylvania economically?
What's happening demographically is that the decade from 2000 to 2010 is a time of stability. The total number of elderly in Pennsylvania is staying almost the same during this 10-year period. But starting early in the next decade, about 2012, the number of people 65 and over begins to escalate dramatically in terms of numbers. That's because the baby boomers will be reaching 65. So we have a window of opportunity here in terms of the elderly program, but during this decade, the fastest growing population age group in Pennsylvania happens to be elderly 85 and older.
Wow.
And these, of course, are frail elderly who typically require more care. So the impact on budgets is actually quite great. State budgets is actually quite great this decade, even though a lot of entitlement programs will escalate during the next decade. So this is a demographic change that can be planned for, but it also relates to how many people are in the labor force, what's our contribution, so what's the tax base and how's that changing in association with demographic trends.
So all of this is happening, and at the same time there are major changes in the makeup of families in Pennsylvania. Fewer children are born, and you talked a moment ago about migration. We're seeing some of our best and brightest going to other states, and of course we refer to that as brain drain. Explain how all of this might shake out and how we might plan for that.
The labor force changes are two key things. One is clearly the baby boomers are now in their late 40s and 50s. This is a period of absolute maximum earnings. So contribution to the tax base in Pennsylvania has an enormous demographic bonus right now. But they are followed by a group that's about 30% smaller in many of these prime working age and maximum income labor force age groups. Then a generation behind is, of course, the children of the baby boomers. They're now in their late teens and 20s. This is the prime group that we have to capture and keep in the Commonwealth, because they are again followed by declining numbers of the children of the birth dearth or the smaller birth cohorts. So you combine these cohort effects that are governed by changing birth rate patterns with then the loss that we've experienced in Pennsylvania for quite a few decades now in young adults, particularly high-educated young adults. And you can see that we have challenges that we're facing of resulting in a labor force that has perhaps less in terms of numbers than a lot of other states, and also has a deficit in terms of highly educated workers.
Let's talk about what the policy implications are for this and what, if anything, Governor Rendell could do to try to entice some of our best and brightest who have migrated to other states to come back to Pennsylvania.
Well, there's, again, I think enticing people back is a very difficult process because you don't, among other things, know who they are. An alternative is to try to keep young adults here. You know who those are because they are in our schools. And so stemming out migration is probably easier than enticing return migration, although, of course, the latter does happen. There are people who lived here, moved someplace else, and who are now returning for lots of reasons, some of them having to do with family ties.
Pennsylvania ranks second to last in the percentage of workers who have bachelor's degree. I'm wondering how that plays out in terms of just how competitive Pennsylvania is in terms of the labor force.
Well, we're second to last compared with our surrounding states. So, but those are the states, the surrounding states with the exception of West Virginia, is where a lot of our young people move to. So we are at a competitive disadvantage. So any employer who's thinking about locating in the Northeast and needs a skilled, educated labor force looks at this information and compares Pennsylvania with New Jersey, Maryland, so forth, and sees a much bigger labor force supply of highly educated young people there than here. Does that affect plat location decisions? I think it does, at least that's what they say.
What impact does the fact that Pennsylvania's older population is staying in the workforce longer at some of the at the height of their career in jobs that are, as you said, higher paying? What impact is that having on young professionals trying to get a foothold in a good position in Pennsylvania?
Well, this phenomenon is not unique to Pennsylvania, so I don't think we're disadvantaged in that score. The key will be, is and continues to be, whether companies are willing to invest in skill upgrades for older workers and therefore keep them competitive in terms of their product.
With just a couple of seconds remaining, 1 in 6 Pennsylvanians is a member of a minority or ethnic group. That compares with 1 in 3 nationally, but how is that changing in the coming decades?
We will still continue to be a predominantly white state, but the Hispanic and the Asian populations in Pennsylvania are growing rapidly, grew over between 50 and 60% in the last decade. That will change the face of Pennsylvania as well.
And on that note, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being with us.
Pleasure to be here.
Governor Ridge, I know, made a concerted effort to get Pennsylvanians back to Pennsylvania. I don't know what Governor Rendell is doing.
It really is a difficult thing because, you know, we train them and they leave and then we have to start again, and our population is getting older.
That's right.
The recent explosion of violence at the Indiana Pacer-Detroit Pistons games created a flurry of response from broadcasters, sports psychologists, and fans. Murray Nelson's a Penn State professor of education and he's a sports author. Says that the way we see professional basketball being played today is very different from the way it used to be played. It used to look something like it came out of a rowdy honky-tonk, cage and all.
Well, first of all, it was only professional basketball. Professional basketball was a much different game from college basketball and high school basketball in the early part of the century. It was a game that was played more by lower class, working class people. It was a much rougher game, and in many cases it was sponsored by either companies or ethnic groups or towns to engender a feeling of pride in that particular company or ethnic group or town. So the games were played often for blood, and they got a lot of that. It was not unusual to have people knocked unconscious in games, the players, sometimes the referee, but less often. And early in the century, probably about 1900, there might have been instances of the cages being used before that, but early in the century, in the New York State League, which was a well-known professional league in the early part of the century, Ed Wachter, one of the founders of the league, decided that they would put the game in a cage, and it caught on, and pretty soon all professional basketball in all leagues in the early part of the century was being played in a cage, largely a heavy steel wire cage to keep the ball in play, to keep the game going. The ball was live off the cage, people could run off the cage, and it meant that the games would be much faster. There were no timeouts because the ball went out of bounds. And it also protected the players from very rabid fans.
Well, something that we have run into very recently is the very rabid fan and the very rabid player, and the twain did meet.
Indeed.
And you know, maybe it's time to put the cage back up, or is that's never going to happen?
It's not. The cage was removed in order to get more intimacy between the players and the fans, and to make it seem as if the game was not going to be marked by that kind of distance, both artificial and in this case real. So basketball became more intimate, and people came to the game and could yell and scream, but they kept their distance for the most part. There were instances when players would fight among themselves. That was not uncommon still, and there were some instances when coming on or off the court, the fans would still harass the players, sometimes physically, but for the most part, there were no instances similar to what we just saw, that is, where players would storm into the stands or fans would storm onto the court. There were a few instances we could come up with that were rare, nothing as well developed as the recent incidents.
So there was this trusting period for a while where the professional athletes were exposed to the fans, and now it seems that we're back to where we were. And what happened? How did this transpire?
Well, it wasn't immediate. So I think over time we've seen fans feel that they're more a part of the game, that their participation is an integral part of their team winning and losing. And players, of course, encourage the fans, and when they sweep their arms up and down, get the volume up, and they want fans to be more involved in that sense. We see players leaping into stands in football games, and I think fans have felt that they should be more a part of the game, and in this instance, for whatever reason, and I'm sure more things will come out that'll give us some idea of what those instances and events were, caused that artificial barrier that people seem to believe in to be broken, and fans got much more involved. Now, obviously, having a player in the stands was a significant part of that, but affecting that was the fans tossing things on the player. That's happened in other times too.
They do that. They do that all the time, and they're chucking chairs, they're chucking cups,
batteries.
Is there not a point where the professional athlete has the right, and I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, has the right to walk up and pop someone in the mouth who's doing that to him?
Well, I'd say it has to be no. I think they have to rely on security. They have to rely on people, other fans, and security removing people from the game. I think if you get fans or players going into the stands, then there are no rules anymore, that the game is no longer entertainment. The game is kind of scary, and we saw some people in the stands who were clearly upset, little kids crying, old people who were hurt. There can't be any time when players enter the stands. It just can't happen.
This is like, if you remember the movie with James Caan, Rollerball. I mean, it really has almost gotten to, no, they're not intentionally killing people out there, but it has really gotten out of hand. And there are people like me, I will not go to a professional football game. It's that unpleasant. And I can see why I couldn't go to a professional basketball game. And it's almost, why would a child even be there? Because this is not the first time this type of thing has happened.
No, there was. Vernon Maxwell did this a few years ago for Houston. But basketball games are on the edge and have kind of pushed themselves in that direction. If you go to a professional game, there's always noise. The volume's up, there's more commercialism, and what we see from various commercials is to be more involved and to be louder, and during timeouts, There's no longer a downtime. It seems to accelerate the kind of tension that there is in the game. And as I said, fans feel that they're a part of that contest, and maybe fueled by alcohol, maybe just because they get carried away and they want their team to win and they think they're helping, they get more involved.
Is there anything we can do? Can we pull back at all and get civility back in professional sports?
I think there are a number of things that have to be done from different parties. First, there has to be, unfortunately, more security. Second, there has to be more schooling of players. A lot of players come into the league and have not spent as much time in college, for example, have jumped from high school into professional sports. Even college players, in many cases, have gone through time as players feeling coddled and feeling privileged, and in fact they are.
They are.
And they believe that they can do whatever they want. I don't think they have made enough efforts in professional sports to get their players to understand what their role is in these kind of instances, because it was exceptional. There are often some times when a commissioner of some particular sport will say this is unacceptable, and that's it. But I think they probably need efforts in training camps to say these are the rules that we're going to follow, and these are the kind of things you can expect, and here's the response that we expect. There isn't as much time spent on that because it doesn't seem to have been needed before.
Thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
And like I said in the interview, it's almost impossible for me to go to a professional sporting event anymore.
In fact, my husband took my kids to a Pittsburgh Steelers game just a couple of years ago, and he said never again. The swearing and the drinking was so out of hand that it just was not an enjoyable afternoon with the kids.
Right. I'm not a Puritan. I've been in broadcasting for a long time, so you know I'm not a Puritan, but it was the Pittsburgh Steelers Cleveland games that made me go, no, sorry, can't do it anymore.
If you have story ideas for Pennsylvania Inside Out, we'd like to hear from you. Send your suggestions to Pennsylvania Inside Out. That's 205 Wagner Building, University Park, Pennsylvania, 16802.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.